Thanks for joining our special coverage of G20 Summit in New Delhi. In the first session under the theme One Earth, President Yoon drew the world's attention to climate change and pledged greater action to assist other countries in making the green transition. We connect with our correspondent Oh Soo-young, who is at the Korea Press Center in the Indian capital. Hello there, Soo-young.
Hi, Dami.
So, Soo-young, we heard President Yoon stress the importance of global solidarity in tackling climate change.
Yes, Tammy. So at the first session of the G20 this morning, President Yoon laid out Korea's specific contributions to overcoming the global climate crisis. First, he announced a plan to contribute $300 million to the Green Climate Fund, or GCF, which provides financing for low-emission and climate-resilient projects in developing countries. Now, Seoul's top office says Yoon is aiming to take the lead in providing financial and technical support to countries without the capacity to develop green technologies on their own and also lack some infrastructural support to go with in order to go carbon neutral. Now, South Korea's Hongdo City actually hosts headquarters of the GCF, which was established under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in 2010. Seoul has contributed some $300 million since 2013 and will add another $300 million during the second round of financial contributions next year. Now, President Yoon also pledged to bolster cooperation to help other countries make a clean energy transition and also strengthen energy security based on South Korea's nuclear power plant technology. In particular, Korea will accelerate the development of small nuclear reactors and also help provide hydrogen-powered vehicles and technology as well, with South Korea having become the first country to succeed in mass-producing hydrogen-powered cars. And it's still ranking first in the world in terms of distribution. Seoul's top office says that the country has the industrial prowess to lead in the green transition, which will also help boost South Korea's export markets. Another point was decarbonizing ships and shipping routes based on Seoul and Washington's pledge last year to create a green cargo shipping corridor that links the port of Busan with the ports of Seattle and Tacoma. By presenting these ways that South Korea can best contribute and also benefit from the green transition, Seoul hopes to become recognized as a leading country in climate action as well as a powerhouse of carbon neutral industries.
Korea has been focusing on developing green technology, as its main industries are those with high carbon emissions, such as semiconductors, oil refining, and chemicals. In line with this, President Yoon reiterated Korea's leading role in spreading green technology and experience to emerging countries.
Right. Now, the second session is also scheduled for this afternoon, local time over there. And tomorrow, President Yoon will be speaking at the third, which is the last session under the theme One Future. Now, what will that be about?
Right. Well, the President will speak again at the third and final session titled One Future, as you said. And there he's going to map out Korea's role and contribution to building a free, rules-based international order. To do that, he's likely to expand Seoul's support for Ukraine and also call on G20 members to establish new global norms for the sustainable and ethical advancement of digital technology. Now, ahead of his arrival in New Delhi, Yoon told local media that at a time when the world economy is confronting challenges such as geopolitical competition, high inflation, and the protracted war in Ukraine, the G20 countries must demonstrate their leadership in order to overcome the challenges facing humanity and also move towards a one future of shared prosperity.
Definitely. And also the president's trip to India is significant because it is the 5th year of diplomatic relations between the two countries. He'll be also meeting with Prime Minister Modi, right?
Yes. So right now we don't have the exact time or location just yet, but the presidential office said on Friday that the meeting is expected to take place on Sunday before President Yoon leaves for Seoul. Now, the president said that when he meets with Prime Minister Modi, they will look to strengthen trade and economic relations, first discussing the 2010 Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, and also discuss ways to strengthen cooperation in the defense industry and also high-tech supply chains. Yoon and Modi will also enhance infrastructure cooperation. through South Korea's Economic Development Cooperation Fund, and also ramp up joint research and collaborations in the fields of space, nuclear energy, health, and other key technologies as well. So I'll be keeping you updated when I have more details, of course.
All right. Thank you, Soo-young, for your coverage, as always.
My pleasure.
And another prominent figure who's made it to the G20 summit is U.S. President Joe Biden. He did skip the ASEAN-related meetings earlier this week, but he's made sure to be present at the G20. Let's connect with Jessica Stone, a correspondent at Voice of America. Hello there, Jessica.
Hello, how are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm well. We're getting a little bit of a reprieve from the Indian heat at the moment. I'm very grateful for that.
Nice. Jessica, how are things looking on day one of the G20 summit in New Delhi? Tell us.
Well, I can tell you one thing. This town is almost unrecognizable from its normal day-to-day activity. There's a complete lockdown in central Delhi, and the streets are all but clear of traffic. Lots and lots of security. It's a very secure event. But I did have a chance to run about for the last few days and see a big welcome sign for President Yoon a friendship building for the Korean and Indian alliance, and some welcoming signs as well, of course, for President Biden, a big screen just near the airport showing the last state visit of Prime Minister Modi to the United States. Really everywhere you go here in New Delhi, you see the smiling face of Prime Minister Modi talking about the G20. This is a huge event, of course, for the Indians as they try to put themselves forward on the global stage and become the voice of what they call the global South, the low-income countries that are members of the G20 as well and who need a greater voice in global finance, at least according to the Indian perspective. We will expect today for the U.S. to call for more finance going into the World Bank, the IMF, on the part of G20 countries, and they'll start with their own request to Congress of $3.3 billion to go to the World Bank. There's a greater call by Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, who's also here in New Delhi, to really reform these institutions and help them better serve low-income countries, many of whom have fallen into hard times because they can barely afford to service the interest on their debt for loans that they have taken out for major infrastructure projects.
Right, Jessica, I cannot help but mention how Chinese leader Xi Jinping didn't make it to this year's G20. Now, is the summit this year an opportunity for U.S. President Joe Biden? What's up with that?
It certainly is being seen as such by White House officials. You know, they don't speak for China, but they sort of poke around a little bit with comments like, we believe in a transparent, non-coercive infrastructure funding development scheme. And, you know, there's also the sentiment that the Chinese have really missed an opportunity of their own not being at the G20, especially after Chinese President Xi Jinping saw fit to attend the BRICS Summit, really counter framework that he has joined with Brazil, Russia, and China and South Africa, as well as India. Western analysts note that both Brazil and India are here at the G20, as well as having been members of the BRICS Summit, and that they are able to be members of both frameworks, right? Having a voice is important to these countries in the greater context of the G20, but also in the context of BRICS. I think there's also a question here of the relevance of the G20, and the United States is seeing this G20 and its outreach to the global South as a way to keep it relevant in the face of so many needs in the African Union and elsewhere, who have just been asked to join the G20 by India, and in fact did so today.
Right. I hear there's also a big deal that's about to be sealed. The U.S., India, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are looking to ink a railway deal that will connect the Middle East and India. What is that deal about?
Well, we expect to hear a formal announcement at 5 p.m. local time, which is about 2.5 hours from now. and that'll come during the evening events at the G20 event. We don't have all the details, but this seems to be a type of corridor, a trade corridor, the likes of which is already in existence in Africa, where we would see Middle Eastern countries linked by rail and then linked by ports to India. And this would be a joint investment project between India, the United States, Europe, and the Middle East in order to move energy, commerce, and data through this channel and create additional resilience in supply chains for these items, as well as give all of these countries more of an incentive economically to work more closely together. There's already been a memorandum of understanding under discussion, and we expect to see that signed at 5 p.m. local time. And then the negotiations really have to go forward in earnest. It's a tremendously ambitious project. We do not know how much it's going to cost, and it's not necessarily going to be able to rival the Belt and Road initiatives of China in terms of capitalization. But one thing the White House is clear about is that it is going to be a transparent, non-coercive alternative to the kind of finance deals that the BRI has put forward, particularly for the likes of Sri Lanka, which has spent 70% of its annual revenue just paying the interest on its debt and has had to declare bankruptcy after taking a loan from China.
All right, before I let you go, Jessica, Washington has also warned against a possible arms deal between North Korea and Russia, especially with reports saying that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is heading to Russia in the coming days. Now, Biden will probably send another round of stern messages to North Korea in New Delhi, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly very likely that we'll see some kind of counter-programming because you have the sort of sense of unity here in New Delhi around the G20. And so if we see a meeting even this week between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, you really have the optics of an isolated North Korea with an increasingly isolated Russia, and the very real reality that Washington has said that North Korea will pay a high price in the form of sanctions or leader-level talks. The U.S. is very concerned that this could bring Russia into a Taiwan contingency in particular. And so we do expect to hear some language from President Biden further discouraging North Korea from this type of lending of or selling of weapons to the Russians.
Definitely, Jessica. A busy day indeed ahead for all the leaders and you as well. Thank you for that report.
You bet. Good to see you.
And the G20 summit has come at a good time for President Yoon as South Korea is seeking as much support as possible for Busan's bid to host the World Expo in 2030. Our Kim Do-yeon has the details.
With just 2 months to go until the vote to decide the host of the World Expo 2030, President Yoon Suk-yeol is utilizing his multilateral summit visit to gain support for Busan's bid. According to the top office, by the end of this week, when he has wrapped up both the ASEAN and G20 summits, he will have met with more than 20 leaders from around the world.
President Yoon during this multilateral summit will have a number of one-on-one meetings. He will talk about the Busan Expo, which will focus on solutions to the crises the world faces today while talking about strengthening bilateral cooperations.
At the G20 specifically, on the first day of the summit on Saturday, he's set to meet with 10 leaders. This includes his Argentinian counterpart Alberto Fernandez, who the top office called, quote, a traditionally friendly partner, as well as Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan twice in a one-on-one meeting and during a MICTA meeting between Mexico, Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey, and Australia.
Turkey and South Korea will share how Turkey can be a catalyst for South Korea's cooperation with NATO. This year also marks the 10th anniversary of the two nations' free trade agreement.
What also stands out is that of the 10 meetings on Saturday, 3 are with African leaders from Nigeria, Mauritius, and Comoros. At the Bureau International des Expositions, Africa has the second largest number of votes after Europe, with around 50 of the 179 members' votes coming from the continent. Gaining support from these nations can help win other African nations' votes.
Comoros is the African Union's chairing nation this year. President Yoon will meet President Azali Assoumani again after the G7 to address cooperation in blue economy, agriculture and climate change.
In addition, at events such as the G20 Gala Dinner, the top office says President Yoon will have the chance to candidly speak to other leaders, which will provide a platform for him to discuss Busan's bid and South Korea's ability to host a successful World Expo in 2030. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
The G20 chair says the declaration is almost ready, but it's never been easy for the leaders of the world to find common ground. Now, how challenging will it be this time? Joining me is Professor Choi Hyun-jin. Welcome.
Good evening. Nice to meet you.
So let's jump right into it. Should we be concerned that there'll be no declaration at the end of the summit?
While Russia's war in Ukraine shows no signs of a settlement right now, and the world is watching how leaders representing the 20 largest economies will tackle the crisis of climate change, the food crisis, and the worsening debt crisis of developing countries. And nevertheless, the many media predict that it will be very difficult to produce a joint declaration at this G20 summit. And also there was a previous G20 ministerial meetings, and this meeting had ended without any agreement due to disagreements among its members. And also the absence of Chinese President Xi Jinping and the Russian Vladimir Putin makes this G20 meeting less weighty than in previous years. And also the absence of these two leaders shows that it is unlikely that China and Russia will agree to a joint declaration this time. So last year, there was a G20 summit in Indonesia. And at the time, the G20 leaders narrowly adopted a joint declaration stating that most members strongly condemned the war in Ukraine. So it is interesting because they condemned the war, not Russia.
Right.
But frankly, even this level of a statement is not easy this time. So if the summit ends without any joint declaration, it will show the limits of Western and non-Western cooperation. And this is not a good news for dealing with global challenges such as Ukraine war, the climate change, and also food crisis. So I'm very afraid that a multilateral diplomatic conference like G20 is becoming less able to combat common challenges when the world is divided into rival camps.
Right, not too optimistic for now, but that's why Indian Prime Minister Modi is so concerned that the Ukraine crisis may overshadow the summit again this year. Now, why is he trying so hard to represent the voices of developing countries, the global south?
So that is a very India's foreign strategy nowadays. So in the middle of the conflict between the two largest economies, such as United States and China, there are, and also the protracted war in Ukraine, the so-called middle powers are rising to the center of international politics. And those middle powers include the countries like India, Indonesia, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and South Africa. And these middle powers are moving between the great powers to pursue their national interests rather than falling into one of the rival camps. So why not participating in the Western-led sanctions against Russia? These middle powers are using their geopolitical position to strengthen their role in the international community. And now Indian Prime Minister Modi is attracting global attention, trying to showcase the changing role of middle powers by chairing this G20 this year. So foreign media predict that India will use this meeting to maximize its geopolitical value to position itself as the next great economic and diplomatic power. And the very luxurious welcome dinner hosted by President Joe Biden during Modi's state visit to Washington in June this year, that clearly showed India's elevated status in the international community. So based on this power and status, so India's Modi is trying to use his leadership to unite emerging economies in the global south to address climate change and food security crisis around the world. So that is a basic direction of Indian foreign policy under Modi's leadership.
Right. Then briefly, Professor, how successful do you think that plan will actually go this time at this summit?
There are some successful side and less successful side.
Okay.
So let me go first with the more successful side. So India is the biggest beneficiary of the global supply chain competition between U.S. and China. As the two great powers tussle diplomatically, India has emerged as the factory of the world, just next to China. And also, India is actively seeking economic and technological support from the United States, which sees India as a key partner in this global competition. So in the case of Ukraine, India has not condemned the war or joined the sanction against Russia, but has been buying Russian oil at bargain prices. So in doing so, India is not only gaining economic benefits, but also diplomatic gains through smart diplomacy between Russia and the United States. So India is quite good at walking the tightrope between great powers. So this is a successful side, but there are less successful sides as well. So at this G20, India wants to unite the members by adopting a summit declaration in support of developing economies at this summit. But this effort will face a lot of challenges. So India seeks greater voices for developing countries, but war in Ukraine could overshadow these talks. So it is not easy for 20 leaders of the world to find the common ground when Russia's war in Ukraine poses a greater challenge for meaningful agreement at this G20 meeting. So as you said, the Prime Minister Modi has promised, not to let the Ukraine issue to overshadow the needs of developing countries in the global south. But I believe the many issues are closely affected by the war in Ukraine, and the rivalry between the U.S. and China make this Modi's efforts very difficult.
Right. But the thing is, the rivalry, speaking of rivalry between U.S. and China, President Xi Jinping is not at the summit. Now, how can Biden take this as an opportunity? Like, what do you think?
Yes, it is some opportunity for the United States, especially for President Biden. So there was the meeting between Joe Biden and also Prime Minister Modi yesterday, just a day before the G20 summit begins. And the Biden expressed his desire for greater cooperation between U.S. and India, and the face-to-face meeting between Biden and Modi comes 3 months after Modi's state visit to the United States in this June. So according to the White House, the two leaders established the importance of the Quad. There's a 4 countries security consultative group, and for a free and inclusive Indo-Pacific region. And these two leaders also reaffirmed their commitment to deepening bilateral security cooperation, including space, artificial intelligence, and also defense. So these two countries also agreed to work together to build a resilient global semiconductor supply chain. So President Biden reaffirmed the U.S. commitment to invest in the semiconductor-related research and development for India. So how can we interpret this American move in India? So in the absence of Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, the United States is trying to make a united front with India in its efforts to contain China. So including the Quad and the semiconductor supply chain. But I think, based on the basic principle of Indian foreign policy, India is likely to maintain still its strategic some balance or ambiguity between these two great powers.
Right. It looks like Biden really has the entire summit as to himself. Now, he's also looking to pitch reforms to lending institutions like the World Bank. Now, the question is, why do you think China may be against this objective?
Yes, there are some efforts to reform international financial institutions such as World Bank and IMF. And U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and also said that Joe Biden will showcase American support for developing countries at this G20 meeting. And as a way to achieve this goal and show the American leadership, the President Biden is reforming this institution to increase support for developing countries in the global south. And in fact, the U.S. government has recently asked Congress for an additional $3.3 billion for the World Bank to boost lending for climate change and also infrastructure projects in developing countries. And the U.S. wants other countries to increase their support for World Bank as well, to increase the World Bank lending capacity. So I think this is a type of response to China, which has recently provided vast amounts of money into developing countries through its One Belt, One Road policy. So Biden is making the most of Xi Jinping's absence by emphasizing the U.S. support for developing countries through these efforts. And in other words, the absence of Xi Jinping and Putin provide Biden with some opportunity to expand his global influence. And therefore, it is natural that China is not happy towards this American effort. And because China believes that this kind of reform of international financial institution is a part of American containment policy against China.
Right. Professor Choi, I know North Korean issues are not going to be discussed as much as, the crisis in Ukraine or the food security, but we should be expecting some sort of consensus on North Korea issues, right?
Yes. So, unfortunately, North Korea is not a main agenda of this G20 meeting. But at this meeting, President Yoon Suk-yeol is expected to somehow criticize North Korea's nuclear and missile provocation and call for the international community's cooperation in denuclearization of North Korea and also the enforcement of economic sanctions against Pyongyang. And also, as you mentioned before, the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un is going to visit Russia next week. So many people expect that. So for a summit meeting with Vladimir Putin to discuss possible arms deal. So North Korea could ask Russia to send more food, energy, and also advanced military technology in return for supplying arms to Russia. So regarding this, the White House sent a strong warning message to Pyongyang, saying that North Korea will pay a price in the international community, and if we provide weapons to Russia. And therefore, at the G20, the President Yoon Suk-yeol is likely to send a warning message to North Korea for its military cooperation with Russia, because this is a clear violation of UN Security Council sanctions against North Korea that threaten the world peace. But as I said earlier, there will be. I don't think there will be clear some action plan or mentioning of North Korean threat in the joint declaration.
All right. Professor Choi, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And North Korea, as widely expected, held a military parade overnight to celebrate its founding anniversary. This is already the third military parade this year, a first under the Kim Jong-un regime. Our North Korean Affairs correspondent Lee Dae-hyun tells us more.
North Korea has staged a parade of its paramilitary civil defense force in Pyongyang to mark the 75th anniversary of the regime's founding day. The North's state-run Korean Central News Agency reported on Saturday that the event started at around midnight with a ceremony taking place beforehand at Kim Il-sung Square. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un took part in the event but appears to have not made a speech. Kim's daughter also reportedly accompanied him. The KCNA also said a government delegation from China, including Vice Premier of the People's Republic of China Liu Guozhong, members of the Army Choir of the Russian Armed Forces, the Alexandrov Ensemble, and diplomatic delegations of China and Russia residing in the north were invited to the parade. Participating in the parade were not the official military army this time, but the so-called Worker Peasant Red Guards, a civil defense force in North Korea comprised of about 5.7 million people. Strategic weapons such as intercontinental ballistic missiles also appeared to have not been on display last night. Instead, an array of motorcycles, tractors, and trucks were seen in the parade. Some analysts say this could be interpreted as Pyongyang trying to strengthen internal solidarity instead of showing off its military might. Meanwhile, the Northeast Korean Central Broadcasting Committee said that Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese leader Xi Jinping sent a congratulatory message to Kim following the Northeast founding anniversary. In the letter, Xi said that Beijing hopes to commit to peace and prosperity in the region by strengthening strategic communication with Pyongyang, adding that the positive relations between the two are becoming even steadier. Putin also said that their expansion in bilateral relations would contribute to the security and stability of Northeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula. Now, eyes are on whether the North Korean leader will travel to Russia as the Eastern Economic Forum is set to take place on Sunday in Vladivostok, where Kim is highly likely to meet Putin. Should the talks take place, discussions on arms deal are likely to be brought up on the table. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
A powerful earthquake has struck Morocco, killing over 600 people and leaving at least 320 injured. According to Morocco's Interior Ministry, Friday's earthquake struck the country's high Atlas mountain range at around 11 p.m. local time, with the epicenter located about 72 kilometers southwest of Marrakesh, a popular tourist destination. The 6.8 magnitude quake damaged buildings in the capital city of Rabat, as in the old city of Medina, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The U.S. Geological Survey said the earthquake is the strongest to hit that part of the North African nation in more than a century, and the number of casualties is expected to rise. The chairman of South Korea's main opposition party, Lee Jae-myung, faced prosecutors at Suwon District Prosecutor's Office on Saturday over allegations he sent money illegally to North Korea. The investigation centers on allegations that Sangbangul Group, an underwater manufacturer, unlawfully sent $8 million to North Korea between January 2019 and January 2020 on Lee's behalf. He was governor of Gyeonggi-do province at the time, and the prosecution sees it as a third-party bribery. He says the prosecution's motives are political and that there is no physical evidence to support the allegations. Prosecutors reportedly have 150 pages of questions for Yi and are looking to tie the case to ongoing indictments against him in order to push for his arrest. But Yi has been on hunger strike since August 31st, which could be an obstacle in that process. And this is his fifth appearance at District's Attorney Office. And we also thank you for staying with us through our special coverage of G20 Summit New Delhi. Enjoy your weekend.